prior to the 1960s, not only did families not have much of a choice, in fact, my friend Jean would not call it a choice at all. She would call it a dilemma, kind of a Sophie's choice, where you have your child go to a state institution or you keep your child at home, kind of in the back room, because your friends, your clergy, the psychologist that lives up the street, your doctor, all of those people were recommending that you place your child in a state institution. That was the thinking of the day. They would be better off in a state institution. The philosophy that came out of is that people with developmental disabilities did not have a life worth living. We didn't know how to communicate with people with significant disabilities. We had no strategies for that. We had no communication strategies. So if people couldn't communicate verbally, we assumed that they weren't able to communicate at all. And in fact, we made the assumption that there wasn't a whole lot going on with that person, that they were incapable of any kind of complex thought at all. We also assumed that they couldn't learn as a result of that. We assumed that they couldn't learn, therefore we didn't teach them, therefore they didn't learn, which is kind of an interesting conundrum. It's the self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, if you don't make the attempt, obviously it's not going to happen. Things that are perceived to be real are real in their consequences. So if you believe that a person can't learn, you don't teach them they can't learn, it just reinforces the fact that you were right in the first place. Another thing we thought in that philosophy at that time is that people didn't have lives worth living. One of the consequences of that is that there were times when medical care was withheld. So if you and I might have a heart condition that would be fixable, they would fix it for us, right? For a person with disabilities, they might not fix it because the assumption was they didn't have a life worth living, so let's let the person pass, not in a cruel way. The intention was never to be crual. The intention was just to kind of let them pass because they didn't have a life worth living. So we're going to keep them as comfortable as we can. We're going to do what we can to kind of make that process as tolerable as possible. But again, if you had a condition that was fixable, you and I would get it fixed. The person with Down syndrome might not get it fixed because that medical care was withheld. In the early days, when I was first in this business, I met people that had no teeth. Or I met people that had significant numbers of their teeth missing. And I thought, well, that was really strange. I mean, I'm 20-something, and I'm meeting people who were 25 to 35, and my friends had whole sets of teeth, so what's going on with that? Again, can't learn, therefore we don't teach, therefore they don't learn. We weren't teaching anybody how to take care of their teeth. It was a lot simpler to have teeth pulled and removed than to take care of their teeth from the outside, and they couldn't learn, therefore it was just easier to remove them. So we had a whole generation of people that were in institutions that had, limited teeth, limited access to medical care that might save their lives, and no training. The thinking had changed by the 60s. It was coming out of Scandinavia. It was coming out of a half dozen universities around the country, notably the University of Syracuse. The principles of normalization that we don't talk about anymore, but that we practice. Normalization at its very base is the same life that you and I would want to live. Those principles of normalization and that change in philosophy, those are the big ideas of the day. Huge ideas that were going to change the way we supported people with disabilities from that point forward. Because at that point forward, we started thinking about our lives and about how people with significant disabilities could continue to live in their communities, continue to be part of their families, grow up and have the same kind of lives that their brothers and sisters might have. And that thinking was just beginning to germinate in the 1960s, 1970s. And it led to, again, things that are perceived to be real are real in their consequences. So we began learning communication systems. Some of the very first systems were Bliss symbol systems. You know bliss symbol systems when you drive. A stop sign is a bliss symbol system. So we developed visual systems that helped people with significant disabilities communicate, and we developed kind of behavioral approaches to teaching that were effective. You know, the whole B.F. Skinner thing and all of that, actually there were positive consequences of that. So once it was demonstrated that some of these techniques worked, even a little bit, suddenly the door opened up. Well, if these folks with these significant disabilities can learn, well, who knows what the ceiling is in terms of what they might be able to do. So a lot of effort then was put into developing communication systems, to developing kind of behavioral training systems that would teach people how to do, at the beginning, very rudimentary things. How to put on your shoes, how to take a shower by yourself, how to put on your shirt, how to eat independently. Very rudimentary at the beginning. But you have to understand that prior to that time, even those rudimentary things were thought to be impossible. You know, the staff at a state institution would feed somebody that today could learn how to feed themselves. I mean, just something as simple as that. So once that philosophy changed, the whole thinking about where people ought to live changed. So we went from state institutions, and the state institution population peaked in about 1973. I think there were about 195,000 people in state institutions around the country. We had sterilization boards, we had all kinds of, you know, things that we look at today like, holy cow, how could we ever believe that was a good idea? But those were, even institutions were actually good ideas at the time they were originated. So the very first services that came out of state institutions, well, just to go back to state institutions, there were good ideas because prior to that time in many countries in the world, people with disabilities were put into prison, or they were put into like really super backward things that look like institutions where, you know, you'd have one staff person and 40 people with disabilities, and you'd be lucky if anybody got their, you know, clothes changed in the course of a day's time. So by the time I saw institutions in the late 60s, early 70s, they were much better than they'd ever been before. Still not great places to live. I mean, you would not choose to live with, you know, 2,500 of your closest friends and sleep with 60 people in the same room. Who would choose to do that, except for a couple of nights at a camp or something, but certainly not something you'd do for your life. So as we started thinking about community-based services, they had never been tried before. So now we're thinking about placing group homes in neighborhoods that had never had people with significant disabilities living in them. We were starting to think about jobs. There were demonstration projects, several universities, the University of Oregon being one of them, University of Madison, Wisconsin, Virginia Commonwealth, Syracuse, were experimenting with taking people out of state institutions and teaching them how to do work tasks. And they were being successful. They were being productive. And they could take that kind of piece rate production process, turn it into an hourly pay rate. People were starting to get paid for the very first time. We're talking about the early 1970s, mid-1970s. So as more people started to come out of state institutions and move into group homes, and we could talk a little bit about that process. We should talk about that process. And also then they were being placed into these kind of segregated, sheltered workshops. Well, the community reaction wasn't all that positive at the beginning. I mean, there were zoning laws that were designed for college students, to keep a bunch of college students out of your neighborhood. And they were being used to actually keep people with disabilities out of local neighborhoods. So you'd go to a planning commission meeting with an organization that wanted to put a house in a neighborhood, and the room might hold 75 people, and 150 people would show up, and most of them were concerned and angry and sort of outraged that people would move into their neighborhood next door to them. And I think it's, in retrospect, It's because we had no exposure. It's because we had no contact. Communities had no context. The presumption was these people had lived in institutions for a reason. It was probably some really bad reason, like the reason people go to prison or something. And what are they going to do? Are our children going to be safe? So they were concerned about all those kinds of things. And as a result, they worked very hard to keep houses out of their neighborhoods. So if you go all around the country, the very first houses that were placed in neighborhoods all around the country were placed in the most marginal neighborhoods of the cities. The parts of the city where the crime rate was the highest, there weren't any street lamps and sidewalks, and drugs were being sold. And that's where these vulnerable folks were first placed in community settings because of that fear. There was less pushback from the neighbors in those neighborhoods than there were in nicer neighborhoods in the city. Similarly, for segregated shelter workshops, because we had no history of people working in regular businesses, so they had, a local business would have no context for hiring a person into their business at all. And we still didn't know how much people could learn. Our strategies were still pretty rudimentary. So we weren't we were maybe a little concerned too about what behavior might occur, because you saw some pretty funny behaviors in an institutional setting. I remember being in a room one time where there were 40 individuals with disabilities, and they were walking around and they were kind of banging their head and biting their wrists and rocking and making noises that were like jungle noises. And then I got to meet probably 2/3 of the people that were in that room. I got to meet them later when they'd been placed in regular, group homes and living in communities. That behavior almost totally went away. They did what middle school kids do and what every other kid does. They learned from their peers. So if one person was behaving like that, a bunch of them behaved like that. That was normal. That was a normal kind of way to behave in that setting. Not so out here. That looked pretty weird. So, but what happened is people moved and they changed their behavior. And if you have kids or if you watch kids, they have different behavior in different settings. They behave one way with their parents, and they behave a totally different way with the babysitter, and a totally different way with grandma and grandpa, and et cetera. And the people are just like that. So they behave differently in different settings. So once the expectations changed in the community, most of that odd behavior kind of went away. But we were watching that behavior in an institutional setting and wondering initially how that was going to translate in the community and not knowing for sure. So there was kind of some anxiety, I think, on both sides of that, both the community and folks that were trying to get this done.